Good evening, everybody. We are going to have a 1.5 hour exciting discussion on the Europe-Africa Summit that took place on the 17th and the 18th of February in Brussels. And this is an event that is organized by the Club de Lisboa, the Lisbon Club, which is a kind of a reflection forum in Portugal that is very much dealing also with Europe-Africa relations. And we are very happy that we have a panel of some very distinguished people who have been following this summit very, very closely. And I would like to present these to you. First of all, Lidet Tadesse, who is Associate Director at ECDPM, the European Center for Development Policy Management in Maastricht and in Brussels. Lidet has been very closely associated to the peace and security agendas of the Europe-Africa Partnership, but she also follows the partnership in a more broader context as well. And then we have Ottilia Maunganidze of ISS, very well known to some of you, who has been very, very active also with ISS and with ETTG and others in preparing reflections on the Europe-Africa Summit and the Europe-Africa Partnership. And Ottilia has been in many debates, so we are very happy that from the Southern African region, we have also this voice from the well-known Institute for Security Studies. And then Fernando Jorge Cardoso. Fernando Jorge Cardoso has a very long track record in Europe-Africa relations. I know Fernando, how many? More than 20 years, more than 25 years at least. Fernando has been in very many different capacities, working for the Institute of Strategic Studies in Lisbon and also for Instituto Marquês de Valleflor. And now he's heading also the Lisbon Club, organizing all types of debates on Europe-Africa. And there should have been a fourth participant in this panel. This is Michelle Ndiaye, but last minute, unfortunately, she had to cancel her participation in this panel. This event will be live streamed on Facebook, on YouTube. You can, of course, for those who are listening in at this very moment, also put your comments in the column on comments. So we will carefully take track of your comments and make sure that we direct your comments and questions, observations to the relevant panelists. So with this, I think we can take a start in this webinar. And I would like to start with Lidet. I would like to start with Lidet and ask Lidet what her key takeaways have been of this 6th EU-African Union Summit. To what extent this is a summit that has made progress in a number of content areas, but also maybe on the partnership relationship between both continents. Please, Lidet.
Thanks, Geert. It's great to be with all of you to engage in this conversation. One cannot work at ECDPM and then tire of discussing the EU-Africa topic, so good to be here. Some of the things that I think the partners made progress on in this EU-Africa summit, perhaps the first thing to start from is the general attitude that both actors walked away from. The testing of the temperature would tell us that both actors are relatively okay or relatively satisfied with how the summit worked out. Now, considering that this is a partnership in which there are several politically divisive issues at hand, the fact that both actors on both sides of the Mediterranean walked out with relatively positive signals is something, it's progress. Of course, it's not the end, because this partnership also is one that struggles quite a lot with follow-up. But that will be a point that I will raise at a later point. Now, going back to your question on what was achieved and where did they make progress, I think more concretely, the discussion around vaccines, particularly the promises to deliver 450 million vaccines to Africa, to African countries, I think is progress. This is so because if you looked at the earlier drafts of the declaration, for example, there was no fixed commitment to how many vaccines would be delivered to Africa, but the fact that they, through negotiations, decided and agreed on specific numbers is significant, and this is also significant considering the fact that, you know, with access to vaccines, the problem isn't money per se, but access to the actual vaccine. So this commitment to actually say we will deliver X number of vaccines before the end of the year, in fact, by mid 2022 is positive. However, I think this discussion on vaccines and the progress that is made on delivery of vaccines was also overshadowed by negotiations on intellectual rights on vaccines, where they did not make progress. And in fact, in the discussion or in the negotiation, that was the ask that the African stakeholders had put on the table. What they wanted, even more so than access to vaccines or the EU donating vaccines, was that they be given, you know, access to the intellectual property rights, so that vaccines could be produced in greater numbers and be procured. The EU did, you know, after having not made progress on the waiver of vaccine intellectual rights, the EU did try to make amends by promising, you know, a bit more of money and then support to vaccine production hubs in the continent. But in a way, it does leave one thinking that, you know, the EU sometimes gives with one hand and takes away with the other, because what are you going to do with these vaccine hubs if you actually don't have the intellectual property rights to use these hubs to produce vaccines? So there's a bit of an ambivalence. But me personally, I take the earmarking of X number of vaccines being delivered to African countries as a positive step. Now, the second thing has to do with SDR allocations. Of course, people who work on this do say this is not sufficient. What has been agreed is not sufficient. But the fact that this was, you know, on the table, and the fact that some agreement has been made on how much could be allocated to African countries, I think is some progress to build on. So we can't really expect the summit to solve all problems, and SDR allocation in the financial system, globally speaking, needs to be critically interrogated. But, you know, for starters, I think this is positive. Then I could say a few things about what would otherwise seem very minimal progress made on the partnership, on wording around history. You know, it says, the declaration says acknowledgement of history. It's not shared history, but acknowledgement of history. And there are some things within the declaration that I think are important, that sort of imply that these people are, you know, starting to take the matter seriously and get a bit more political. But I can maybe come back to these points at a later time. Thanks, Geert.
Thank you, Lidet. Very interesting. And let's ask now Ottilia how she perceived this summit, because Southern Africa at a certain moment was also a little bit caught in the eye of the Omicron storm, and travel bans. And some Southern Africans would say, look, what Europe is doing is too little, too late. How do you react to that, Ottilia?
Thanks a lot, Geert, and a special thanks to Lidet for starting the conversation and really framing it so well. I'll try to be quite brief in my initial response on, you know, general perceptions around the summit itself. To say that obviously the summit in and of itself is by no ways the yardstick on which we can measure the partnership between Europe and Africa, or the EU and the Of course, it having come when it did, which was 2 years after it was meant to have happened, and with the many frustrations around the delays, you can appreciate the anticipation, one, of the summit actually happening, but also then of what comes after that. A lot of the questions that were posed ahead of the summit were, we've heard some of these statements before. It's almost as if there's some rhetoric that doesn't bear repeating. What people really wanted to see out of the summit was action. So what's going to happen post that? So in terms of general perceptions, first, this is the first summit between the EU and the AU where it wasn't singularly conference style, so to speak. So the introduction of roundtables, thematic roundtables, clustered onto the key issues was, for me, a good step. Whether that doesn't just mean it's a different way of talking, but you're still talking about things that won't be done, is something that we'll only be able to assess further down the line. You know, it's only about 10 days now since the summit itself, so a lot of the action that we want to see is only going to be rolled out. Which brings me then to the other element, which is around the establishment of a technical committee. One that is meant to track and look at implementation. So this idea that the summit itself is not enough, while having already been recognized between the two parties, this seems to be one of the really solid steps towards saying we need to allocate responsibilities to particular individuals or particular teams to be able to take that forward. But that doesn't take away from the big cloud, Geert, that you spoke to. The meeting happened at a time when we're obviously still in the COVID-19 pandemic, otherwise would all be in Lisbon having this conversation. It also happened at a time when Europe was braving for now escalating conflict in its other immediate neighborhood to the east. And so there was quite a lot that could have made the summit not go well. So overall, taking a step back, reflecting on the key issues that the leaders had to deal with, they at least had that conversation. The elephant that will remain in the room relates to the question around vaccine equity and a unified response to a threat that is outside of the control of individual countries. Lidet has already spoken to this, but for me to just say by way of highlighting, putting in bold, italics, that this issue should not be disregarded as a minor issue among many. Because if the EU and the AU cannot, in practice, find a proper resolution to an issue that, for example, South Africa, in pushing for a TRIPS waiver, has been advocating for years, it could actually become a major stumbling block, even on those areas of collaboration that are easy or that appear to be easy. Suddenly, Geert, if you don't mind my using a metaphor here, suddenly some of the low-hanging fruit may become a little bit higher if you're unable to solve this big hurdle that's impacting economies, development, and has led to a lot of stagnation across the African continent.
Thank you very much, Ottilia. This was very useful as well. And let's now turn to Fernando. Fernando, you have been there many years ago already, and I remember that you played quite an important role also in the preparatory process of the Lisbon Summit and the first EU-AU Summit in 2007, when you were one of the co-founders of the EARN, the Europe-Africa Policy Research Network. How do you look at this summit, also with your historical perspective, having participated from a certain distance in so many other summits? Has there been progress?
Hi, Geert. It's a pleasure to be here. And I, Lidet, I, Ottilia. Lidet, we have seen each other. Ottilia, we didn't. So it's a pleasure to make acquaintance with you. And as for us, Geert, we know each other 29 years ago.
Oh.
in 1993. So it was a little more than you thought exactly in Senegal.
Don't remind me of my
yes. That's where I took acquaintance with the CDPM itself. Anyway, coming back to your question, I would not disagree with Lidet and Ottilia, but I will add one or two points. My first point is this. I sense that this summit probably was the more well done summit of all the summits that existed until now, because it happened in a very difficult situation, in the midst of a pandemic in Africa, I wouldn't say in the end, but we want to believe that we are in the end of it in Europe. And why did it go like this? My opinion about this is the following, is that fortunately, the president of the European Commission has a geopolitical view. She's a German, but her geopolitical view goes beyond Germany. That's not for chance. That is her first visit when he took over the Commission, when he took charge of the presidency of the Commission. He went to Addis Ababa with all the commissioners. This was a symbolic, but it expressed also a sense of somebody that says European Union losing power, internationally speaking, in a process in which, by the end of last decade, we were and still are living in these dynamics in which the Western focus of economic development is going east. And going east means going to the Pacific and to the Indian Ocean. And that means not only, this does not mean that it is going to China and to India. This means that the multinationals and the enterprises and the businesses are following from other parts. And the things are being decided not more only in London or Washington or New York or Paris, but more and more in other places. And Europe was losing track and was losing importance in this. And in my opinion, the president of the Commission and some of the commissioners and some of the leaders, the European leaders, understood that, our relationship with Africa is very much important, politically speaking. So we have to take care of this and try to give a step further to the steps that we were doing. And let us remember that the relationship between both, let's say, regions began with decolonization. Began with colonization itself, of course. It began with decolonization. And then aid always was in the center of everything, multilaterally and bilaterally speaking. Up to a certain moment until some years ago, when an African minister went to a European capital, he would be, or a prime minister, he would be received by the Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs. But if a minister from Brazil, or a minister from Mexico, or a minister from Singapore goes to Brussels or to Paris, etc., you'd be received by his homonymus. So this way of looking to Africa is disappearing, really, and we are in a process in which we are looking at each other as adults. And I'm seeing that, and I think this is a positive thing, since I'm studying these kinds of things and seeing that. The other point, and this will be my second point for this introduction, is that let's not forget that African Union and European Union are constructions. European Union has not, I said that the President of the Commission has a geopolitical thinking, but European Union does not have a geopolicy. Those who have geopolicies and geoeconomics are states and federations, not the European Union, not the African Union. The geopolicy in Europe is decided by the greatest powers in Europe, by France, by Germany, sometimes with the help of some other countries, mostly by this, when the United Kingdom was there, of course, also with the United Kingdom. And when we look at African Union is a little more for historical questions, for factual questions, more weak in this. There is not a geopolitics of Africa, of African Union. There are various that depend if we speak about North Africa, if we speak about the Horn of Africa, if we speak about the Gulf of Guinea, if we speak about the Indian coast of Indian Ocean, if we speak of Southern Africa, mostly South Africa, and if we speak about Central Africa. So African Union is an astonishing construction because it has to deal with so different situations in an historical process in which the leaders, the first leaders, or one part of the first leaders of the independence are still alive. So we are living in the process of construction of states in this moment. So, and this adulthood is coming. This adulthood in relationships, no matter the difficulties that are sensed in one part of the world and in the other part of the world. I do not have to say to you that the Eastern European countries, they do not know whether Africa is a continent or a country. Okay? If one goes to some of these Eastern countries in Europe, nobody knows anything about African countries. And I am sure that in most African countries, we can also go and people will know about France, about Belgium, about Portugal, maybe, about United Kingdom. But if one asks them about Switzerland, I doubt if anyone knows but the watches and that Switzerland is, well, an important country when it takes about finances. So this is my point. We are speaking about constructions, and the constructions are being constructed in a good way now.
Yeah. So very interesting first round, I would say. What I retain is that in terms of methodology, method, that most of you agree that this was amongst the better summits, probably even the more well done, as Fernando says. On the European side, there was for the first time a kind of geopolitical vision. We had, of course, big discussions, and like any other summit, there's always a one single issue that dominates the discussions. And this time it was definitely the vaccine equity issue, where there is some mixed feelings. Yes, the European Union has made efforts to support these regional hubs where vaccines can be produced, but no, the European Union has not been very open in making sure that the intellectual property rights on these vaccines would be made public. So there is an issue there. I didn't hear you talking about other key areas that are quite important these days in the partnership, the green transformation, the energy issues, the migration issues. Does it mean that these issues have not been given enough attention, also the peace and security issues, Lidet?
I think there, especially with the discussion on energy, and perhaps broadly speaking, part of the discussion around where is the partnership, have they made progress, I guess, relates also to what was discussed and why was it discussed, and what was not discussed and why was it not discussed. For example, a lot of us covering this topic have noticed that the issue around digitalization, the issue around energy transition, didn't receive the type of treatment or the type of political weight that those of us who are based in the European capitals would often see and hear, coming from the EU, because energy or the green transition and digitalization are two very salient topics on the European agenda, and two that are also featured in Team Europe initiatives and things like that. So these two topics are quite big on the European agenda. And for me, seeing the fact that they are not given the same level of weight on the EU-Africa partnership, and that on the agenda, they were sort of at the bottom in a way is reassuring that, again, maybe the two sides are again starting to discuss things and be realistic about how they prioritize their joint issues to make sure that this doesn't end up being a partnership or a summit that is dominated by one party. So in a way, we should also appreciate what comes out or what came out of the summit, not only by what we saw in the declaration, but by what was also omitted from the declaration and from the discussion. And it's not to say that these two are not important topics, but the fact that the African side expressed its reservations, saying, we haven't done our homework, we need to interrogate these issues further, and hence we wish to not discuss it in great detail at this summit, I think is positive. Now, having said that, of course, in the opening statement of President Macky Sall, there were issues raised around energy transition and how to make that a just energy transition. And that while the continent does commit to the Paris Agreement, one needs to be very pragmatic about how energy transition occurs. And we haven't seen commitment. And I guess that was part of the ask from the African side on the continuation of European investments on what is otherwise, coal production or hydrocarbons and what would otherwise be considered unclean or dirty energy production. But there was still in the statement recognition that number one, these two continents have differentiated needs on energy. The questions are quite different. For Africa, the question has to do with access to energy itself. I mean, the number of people in the continent that have electric supply itself is quite meager. And then secondly, after acknowledging the differentiated needs, the other one has to do with, I guess, some sort of, at least in principle, agreement that even when we talk about energy transition, in the meantime, the continent would continue to use natural resources for its energy production, including coal, for example. So there was that kind of, let's say, concession or agreement that this is inevitable and this is happening. But of course, it didn't meet the expectations from the African side, I think, on the promise for continuation of European investments on carbon-based energy production going forward. But I think the whole thing around climate justice and equity around energy production, again, one is a global question that I think goes beyond the two continents as well.
Thank you. Quick reaction, Ottilia, on these other areas, thematic areas that have been covered or maybe not covered well enough, and maybe also a quick reaction also to a key topic that was quite dominant, I felt, in the summit. There was this discussion on Europe's global gateway and the financing that Europe would put into this global gateway investments. It sometimes gave me a little bit the impression that we were, even if we wanted to have a more reciprocal type of relationship, that it was still very one-sided. One party committing money to the other party, committing investments. Of course, these investments are extremely needed, very, very important. But maybe this is something on which you could comment. Did you feel that this reciprocity was really better than it used to be in the past? Or is there still some way to go there? Ottilia.
Right. Thanks for that. I feel like we almost have to take one 22-year step back. The partnership between the EU and Africa that we're currently discussing is really a partnership between the two continents in respect of Africa. It's by no way a bilateral or a two-way street, in the sense that it's a relationship that also looks at questions of peace and security, for example, in Europe, of migration and mobility in Europe, of climate change, environment, a green transition in Europe. It's a partnership that's looking at issues on the African continent. That in and of itself already creates a certain kind of imbalance, whether intentional or otherwise. At a stage, perhaps this links to what Fernando said earlier around the stage of state development in which we all are. At a stage later on down the line, when discussions between the EU and Africa are not limited to issues on the African continent needing to be addressed, then perhaps we can look at the global gateway as an example from a different point of departure. So recognizing that this is a partnership that focuses essentially on African issues and on how those African issues relate to Europe, the gateway in and of itself is not inherently problematic. Questions around how do you level the playing field between Africa, which is still a largely developing continent, and the reason it's largely a developing continent is a recognition of the history between the two continents, a history of extraction and a history of colonialization and separate development. So if you take that as your point of departure, you recognize that in order for you to be able to have Europe and Africa almost playing at the same level as it relates economically and otherwise, that what is needed are investments on the African continent, investments in education, investments in development, investments in other areas of industry, culture, trade, tourism even, that allow for us to get to a situation where when we speak about the African Union, we don't speak about it as an entity that still receives the majority of its funding from the European Union or European donors, but in fact is also playing on an equal footing in that regard. So that's the one point of departure. And I think it's just a recognition of the status of the partnership and the two continents. Issues that perhaps could have been given greater emphasis that at this time around, even for me, I felt were slightly overshadowed is not the word, but not given the right emphasis. And this could have been an attempt to shift the narrative. Questions around migration and mobility, for example, have been seen as questions where essentially you throw absolutely everything that you have in the cupboard and you hope that it sticks. And so you can have a conversation about migration and mobility in essentially what is a culture and education platform. And you speak about it in terms of development, which is good, which is part of the AU's point of departure. But as a result, you then have questions around smuggling, trafficking in persons, around securitization of migration, kept in there, but not thrashed out. And these are points of great disagreement between Africa and Europe, but also within the African continent. So to gloss over some of those key issues that we know in reality impact the relationship between the two continents, is to almost want to focus on, I'll call them again, the low-hanging fruit, in the hope that that's how you build the relationship. But if Africa and Europe cannot agree on a clear pathway as it relates to migration and mobility, then the other areas, including questions of investment that should otherwise be easy wins, become difficult. And I think, unfortunately, and it's always difficult because we're analyzing a summit, right? Is unfortunately the real test about have we seen a departure is not in the text of the declaration. It's not in the statements made at the summit. It's what's happening right now. And the reality is right now, the focus is not on the EU-Africa summit. Perhaps it was great timing that it happened before the global chaos, so to speak. But right now, the focus is not on that. And my worry is we can speak about a great summit. We can speak about some things that were left out. But over time, it will just be an event on the calendar of African and European leaders. And we'll be talking about what needs to be discussed next.
Talking about reciprocity, Ottilia and Lidet, then I turn to Fernando. But how come that few African leaders bring up, for example, the issue of the undermining of the rule of law in countries like Hungary and Poland, the emerging crisis in Ukraine, because at that moment we knew that we were going to run into difficulties in Europe. How come that this is not raised? Because if we talk about a reciprocal type of summit, you should expect that this should be brought up by someone.
We're not there yet, Geert. We're not at a stage where we can speak of it as a reciprocal partnership yet. That is the ideal. That is the point to which these two continents need to be working towards. At the moment, unfortunately, even for African leaders, and reasonably so for African leaders, African issues are first of mind. But, and I'll use an example of something that happened in the past week. Things have been moving so quickly that we're speaking about activities in the past week as if they're history. The Namibian government was the first African government to issue any form of statement in respect of Ukraine and Russia. Mm-hmm. The initial response, and I say this because a lot of people don't know this. A lot of people know the statement made by the Kenyan ambassador at the UN in respect of Ukraine and Russia. A lot of people know that South Africa's foreign ministry has also made a statement. Namibia is not South Africa. Namibia is not Kenya. Two countries that have recently or currently are at the UN Security Council. So Namibia makes a statement condemning what is essentially, in their mind, a crime of aggression, an invasion, an annexation of the territory of Ukraine. Initial responses were, but who's going to listen to Namibia, right? As if to say, Namibia can't comment on global debates. And I personally had to remind people that if it weren't for that small southern Western African country, UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security would not exist. Something now that is being championed through national action plans by Europe, by European countries and by African countries. And I use that as an example because this idea that Africa plays on the global stage, but only if it is on the menu and not as an agenda setter, is something that's very real. And it impacts the way in which the relationship plays out. Hopefully, in the near future, not the distant future, we can have a conversation where when we speak about governance, when we speak about civic space, when we speak about human rights, we can be able to highlight as clearly as Europe does in respect of Africa, we can be able to highlight what will be an impending refugee and humanitarian crisis in respect of Ukraine, where we have seen border authorities reject Africans at the border. We need to be having those conversations, and perhaps we'll get there, but it shouldn't be because of a crisis. We need to be able to get there because the best way to build both continents is to have open and honest conversations about the situations in each other's continents, not only what's going on in Africa.
Absolutely, very interesting observations. We come back to the Ukraine issue later on, but this was already very interesting. What I retain is Africa is not an agenda setter yet. But I think if I look at the declaration and the way it had been prepared, and we looked also at different draft versions, there was quite a lot of input from the African Union side. So there is definitely progress there. Fernando, how do you look at that reciprocal type of relationship?
You know what I think, Gert. I was trying to refrain myself. I believe that this relationship began for historical reasons, factual reasons, began unequal, and it is unequal. It is not a relationship of equals. And because it cannot be a relationship of unequals, it is not because there is somebody that does not want it to be a reciprocity or a relationship between equals. It is because the facts are facts. In Europe, the things now are composing in a sense, as I said in the beginning, it's my opinion, in a sense in which Africa, if Africa, I mean, African leaders are able to see this window, Africa can play a more relevant role in the international order. I'm not only speaking about Europe, I'm speaking about globally. And this is, but Africa has to give up, because my point is that the scene, let's put it like this, not the word is not seen, but you pardon me, my first language is not English, but the question is that in Africa, when people think or leaders think about Europe, it is the prime minister, the president, the minister of finances, and the other ministers that think about that. Why? Because the flows of money and technological help, etc., that are coming from Europe and from China, whatever, are important for the national budget. But when we come to Europe, Africa is a question of the development ministers and of the institutions of aid and of the civic place. And now, because the world is changing very, very quickly, we are really a testimony of the end of the phase of the post-Cold War. This war in Ukraine marks the end of the global order that came after the end of the Cold War. Now we are entering in a new order in which Africa has a role and can play a role if there are leaders that show the other fellow leaders that they have really a role and they are important. When we look at this, my point has always been this one. We cannot hide aid with the word partnership. Partnership is partnership. Aid is aid and should be branded aid. And the question is that the relationship between Africa and Europe until now has been constructed from aid to economics, from aid to politics, from aid to security. Now it's the time to put the things the other way around and to reconstruct again from the political, the economic, the strategic, and the security side. And then aid is a relevant part of it, but it has to be branded aid. We cannot put geopolicy inside aid. We cannot put geoeconomics inside aid. We cannot put security inside aid, okay? As it has been happening through all these decades. That's why Africa has been a particular way of European leaders looking at the whole continent, of something that is not equal. And it's not equal. We are not equals. Inside Europe, we are not equals. Okay, inside Portugal also, we are not equals. So that's not the problem. The problem is acknowledging it and speaking about things as things are. And from then on, we can proceed and not lie to each other. That's my major point. I believe that working on this thing, you can understand what I mean, but I can be a little more concrete. I can be a little more concrete and say the following. Coming to the vaccines. I think that Europe got the wrong end when some European countries, beginning with Germany, decided to oppose the waiver of patents. And the other European countries followed. Even when we speak with some minister of some other European countries, they would say, oh, we would favor a waiver, but you know, it's very important, the French-German relationship in Europe, so that European Union can hold together, etc., etc., etc. But now that we came to a position in which European Union, through a German voice, said that they are in favor of building 5 factories to produce vaccines in 5 different countries in Africa and to transfer the technology, this is a completely different scenario and should be taken. And for example, in the first technical meeting that will occur somewhere in the middle of the year, this should be asked how things are going in this way, because we have always, or we that are interested in development in Africa, we have always spoken about technology transfer of technology, because that's the point, the transfer of technology. It can begin by being foreigner. The question is the process. If it begins in one sense, it cannot end as it has begun, because if not, it will be like a mine of diamonds, okay? The diamonds were there, we began, at the end, the diamonds are not there, and nothing happened, okay? It cannot be like this. So I believe that now the world is changing very quickly, and the Africans, for example, about Ottilia, you mentioned the question of Poland. I will tell the country by its own name. When some border police stopped the flow of Nigerians to come from Ukraine to Poland. Well, the Polish government issued a statement today saying, I'm sorry, that is not our idea. We want to let everybody pass. This coming from the Polish government, for me, European, is something that I was not expecting at all. And this is happening because facts are changing in Europe. Hungary saying that we welcome Ukrainians. Okay, we can say that's because they are white. Okay, but those that were coming from the East were also white. Okay, they are religiously different. Okay, but Ukrainians are Orthodox, are not Catholic. So the point is that things are changing. And I completely agree with you when you said that at this time in the next rounds, when some European things are put on the table to be discussed.
Good, very good. In the meantime, I see that we get questions also in the chat, the comments. That's very good. We will definitely give the necessary attention to these questions, because there's still a round where we go a little bit deeper also into the impact of the war in Ukraine for the relationship of Africa-Europe. This is going to be a very important issue later on. What I would like to do now is to focus particularly on the implementation side. We've had all these nice declarations, radical overhaul of the relationship, big statements, heads of states who were kissing each other. It was an incredible, call it emotional type of atmosphere that was created by some of the leaders. But then the question is, of course, everybody goes home. What is going to happen? Do we have to wait for the next summit in 3 years' time from now? And this summit will be somewhere in Africa, and then start to wake up again a few weeks before the summit? Or can we really believe that this time the follow-up, the implementation side will be taken seriously? There's a number of mechanisms that, by the way, were also proposed by the African Union side, the joint ministerial African Union, European Union Committee. There's also talk of other technical committees. How do you look at that, Ottilia? Let's start with you.
So, like I said in my first response to your question, Gert, the introduction of technical committees is a good one. The test, though, because we haven't really seen what will be the composition of the technical committees. Will there be subcommittees dealing with very specific substantive streams? And this connects also to a question I think that's been posed in the comment section by Emmanuel Mbiozo, which is about beyond the rhetoric. I think that's the question she's posing. Beyond the rhetoric, are there a few tangible things? And her question relates specifically to green transition and questions of migration and mobility. And I think they're there. The only thing, and I keep going back to this because the summit is important. And the reason the summit is important is precisely for the reason why this conversation that we are having here is important. You can't build trust, you can't build collegiality in a vacuum. You do have to have, whether informal or formal types of conversations about issues. They can get impassioned, they can be very concrete on certain areas, but these meetings, for all that they cost, are actually worth bringing people together to have concentrated discussions on these. The declaration that almost always comes out is often, I would lean less to it being hyperbole, but more to it being rhetoric, right? So we are committed, we are jointly committed towards a green transition that recognizes the realities of a developing continent vis-a-vis a more developed one. We recognize the importance of the connection between development, migration, and mobility, while also underscoring the security risks. It's one thing to recognize those. It's really another thing to have some practical implementation. Already before the summit, and this follows COP26, bilateral conversations around specific funding mechanisms, specific technical support mechanisms in respect of cleaner energy and moving towards a just transition were already starting. What I would hope to see now that the leaders have met at continental level is that this is not just a bilateral engagement that happens between Europe and middle income African countries. The countries for whom this kind of injection is equally as important are the lower income countries that may not have the security that needs to be secured for some of this work. When it comes to questions around migration and mobility, for example, it's literally a laundry list of anything possible that you can speak of on migration. It's everything from legal labor pathways to thwarting smuggling and trafficking in persons to addressing the nexus between conflict and displacement. But practically, a lot of the solutions lie in dealing with or what it is that pushes people out of countries. And I'm not speaking about push factors in the sort of esoteric sense of it. I'm speaking about the range of issues affecting the decision making to move, whether voluntary or involuntary. And this connects to other issues. It's questions around climate change and its impact on livelihoods and how it's having a trickle effect on other issues that then leads people to move. It's limited opportunities in respect of education or forms of employment that make a skills transfer between Europe and Africa critical, but not always beneficial. It's about difference in demographics between the African continent that has a median age of just under 27 vis-a-vis Europe, which sits at a median age over 40, where you need to recognize that there are ways that you can work together and collaborate that go beyond 10 sentences on any of these issues. And I'll say this again, the proof of the pudding, that is the summit, will really be in which of these issues highlighted are given emphasis. And emphasis isn't just about talking about them, emphasis requires resources. And I'm not just speaking about financial resources, it's the right human resources, human and intellectual resources to be able to get this off the ground. And that's going to be a challenge in a year when we are confronted with existing conflicts. And we haven't even spoken, Geert, about the fact that right now we have a growing tension between European intervention in peace and security initiatives on the continent and the situation in the Sahel and the situation in the Horn of Africa, and that could have an impact on the relationship going forward. But we haven't really gone into that yet. But I think we have to have this at the back of our minds that some of the spoilers of a partnership are already there, and we need to guard against or mitigate the potential risks of those spoilers while looking at what are the elements that where collaboration can continue, because let's not act as if the summit was the start of the relationship. That's why I said we need to go 22 years back to where we started in terms of trying to rebuild or restart engagement between the two continents, and recognizing that a lot of the initiatives already are there. One of them, and I'm going to throw a controversial cat here so that Lidet can catch it, is what are we going to do about this reconfiguration of an Africa Peace facility that is now Africa Peace Fund, that is now this European Peace facility, where we don't even know how much financial resources will be left in the European Peace Facility because it's dealing with a raging conflict now. As a continent, Europe has to deal with a current conflict that is within its immediate neighborhood as well. That's for you, Lidet.
Yeah, that's absolutely a good question for Lidet. And I would like to add, of course, what we see or what we can predict. It's not only about the European Peace Facility, but the whole attention of the European Union could indeed shift towards the East for the next years to come. And many of the promises made in this Europe-Africa summit could be becoming, in vain and could not be followed up. So what can be really assured to be done? What should be done at this very moment to make sure that, as Aimé says in the comments, that we get this concrete action in the context as described by Ottilia at this very moment? Please, Lidet.
Yeah, I mean, Ottilia, well, also Fernando, they have made quite a lot of good points on reciprocity, the basis of the partnership, and then perhaps also the lack of, maybe it's my assessment, but the lack of paradigm shift in this partnership that would, take the two sides to get together towards this path of, partnership of equals and things like that. But I won't comment on those ones. Maybe going back to your question around the EPF or the European Peace Facility and implications. One of the concerns around the European Peace Facility, and it still is a viable concern still, is the fact that the EU would have capabilities to pass on arms and to forge direct partnership with armed groups in Africa or member states in Africa. So that is one concern. But the other concern is the fact that because the European Peace Facility is a global instrument and one that covers beyond the continent of Africa, and because in that pot of money, specific funds are not earmarked for African peace and security, that a lot of the funds in the European Peace Facility could be diverted. And I think some of the promises made already by the European Union this morning on how much military assistance could be, including weapons, could be given to Ukraine, I think a lot of it is coming from the European Peace Facility. So there are questions around then, have the African actors, for example, negotiated earmarking of money? I don't think they have. Have they negotiated some role for the African Union on the monitoring, to have some sort of monetary role on how the EPF will be operationalized in the African context? I don't think they have, because we haven't heard any of these things, which, if they had occurred, would have been breakthroughs, and both of them would want to announce them publicly, So going forward, I think how this changes the partnership is yet to be seen, and that is one of the things that we will see. Whether or not this would, for example, push the European Union to support the African Union more strongly and more politically, for the AU to sort of finalize this unfinished negotiations with the United Nations on getting funds for African peace support operations from UN assessed contributions is yet to be seen. That is one of the things that we also saw in the declarations, saying that this would be something that the two continents would work towards. But this is a conversation that has taken 2-3 years, so we'll see if this also puts the momentum back on the continent to sort of push the conversation forward and use this as a pathway for getting predictable funding for African peace support operations. But having said that, I think there's also something to be said about how, as Fernando earlier mentioned, about how global geopolitics is changing, and how this could potentially reframe the partnership and expectations of the two partners on each other. And what is, what in the 21st century, what do you expect your partner to, how do you expect your partner to see you? And what are you also putting to the table on the partnership? And I wanted to comment on something Fernando said earlier, which is, from the point of view of African stakeholders, and I think rightly so, the fact that the EU, as Fernando is giving this historical overview, that the EU or EU member states are now giving African states the sort of diplomatic respect that they weren't getting, 10, 15 years ago. And the fact that the EU and Europe in specific is treating Africa as a political actor and trying to think beyond aid and trying to think in terms of geopolitics and forging a partnership there is all positive. But for an African of 21st century, example me, this doesn't impress me because in a way, I would have expected even 20 years ago for European member states to treat African diplomats the way they would treat Brazilian diplomats, that the fact that it has taken 20 years could look positive and could look something to congratulate from a European point of view, but from an African point of view, it still is like, we're miles away, from coming to a partnership of respect, not equals, but respect. So part of what is happening in this partnership, what I see is the European actors sort of feel like they are making a lot of progress, and maybe from where things were in 20 years ago, they are making a lot of progress, but it's not enough because the African stakeholders are sort of expecting the minimum courtesy, minimum respect that is afforded to any heads of state or any political actor. And I think this differentiated assessment of where the partnership is going, where one feels like they're doing amazing, where the other feels like we're not seeing the fruits of this partnership, is sort of part of the problem. But I'll keep it there.
Very good, Lidet. Thanks for being so frank, because this brings me to another round in our discussions. We have a volatile, multipolar world, different players. We talk a lot about China in Africa. These days, of course, inevitably, we also have to talk about Russia in Africa, in the Sahel, and also in other parts of Africa. Where is it that Europe stands in all this? How attractive is the European Union to Africa? Building on what you just said about respect and other elements that you raised, how attractive is the EU still for Africa? Maybe Ottilia, and then I give also the floor to Fernando. But let's start with our two African colleagues. In this multipolar world, is there still a role and a future for the European Union with Africa?
Well, I'll start with this last part of your question, which is around, is there still a role for Europe or the European Union within the African context? There's a couple of things that we cannot change, Geert, whether we like it or not. We cannot change the geographic proximity of Europe and Africa. We cannot change the history or even the present in terms of relationships when it comes to questions of trade between Africa and Europe. Those are things that we cannot change. Why I start there is because there will always be some form of a relationship between Europe and Africa. The extent to which that relationship will look like it currently does or has done for the past while is what is changing and what Fernando has alluded to, and Lidet likewise. Now, earlier you asked me a question about the global gateway. Now, where could this idea have come from, possibly? Where you look at, for example, the nature of not just China, but also Turkey's engagement on the African continent that has focused on very specific infrastructural or technical development initiatives and projects that are not framed necessarily as investment initiatives, but quite frankly, if we're being blunt and looking at what if you're to call a spade, not a big spoon, that is part of what they are. Whether it's buying into a new space where you haven't operated in that way before, and I need to stress that none of these actors are new to the African continent. So it's not as if China's engagement on the African continent is something that's only come up in the last 2 decades. Not at all. A lot of these countries, and even now, have had a history, whether in support or otherwise, that has involved Chinese engagement, Turkish engagement, Middle Eastern engagement, Russian engagement, India, and other parts of the world as well. What is changing is how Africa barters or negotiates some of those partnerships. When you have multiple partners with whom you can have these conversations, and I recall, I think it was from a roundtable that we had near the end of last year, Geert, if you'll remember, where we had a conversation about if, for example, it's China comes and says, look, we're going to build a railway station. And Germany says, we will also like to build a railway station, but first, you must meet these targets. The negotiation almost becomes, you know what? We don't have time for your targets. We need to transport stuff from the coast inland ASAP. Even if the terms of the final agreement with the other partner are not as favorable, this one has immediate results and consequences. So Europe will need to start rethinking how it perceives Africa. It's the agency question that keeps coming up over and over again. Now, going on to my final point around a reshaping of the global world order. Because yesterday, and I keep bringing Ukraine into this conversation, not because I'm as invested in that conflict, but I recognize the impact globally. And this ties into a question that Leticia has asked on YouTube. The impact that it has on existing relationships cannot be underestimated. Now, because the UN Security Council had a procedural conversation around decisions on veto, this allowed for a conversation at the UN General Assembly around what could be the first post-1973 substantive conversation at General Assembly level around the crime of aggression, right? People may be thinking about it in terms of the current conflict that's ongoing, but the reality is, on a substantive matter, this relates to a discussion that was initiated years ago that has seen an adoption of a definition of the crime of aggression, at least for countries that are parties to the Rome Statute, but that hasn't had the potential level of debate that we're seeing now. And for me, that speaks to reshaping the holes in which some conversations may have. We could be having this conversation next year when there is greater impetus for even UN Security Council reform, because what greater way to be having a conversation about where and when can countries exercise their veto than where one of the parties, the perceived aggressor in this context, has the power to veto decisions. So we can be seeing reform. And why is this important for Africa? And why does this matter around the global world order? Africa has 54 member states. Getting the buy-in and the support of 54 African countries in respect of any resolution at the General Assembly is almost assured success. If you don't have that buy-in, you won't ever get 2/3, put simply. And so you need this block, and Africa is starting to see that they're not just in the room to observe other countries speak, but they wield an equal and potentially strong vote in decisions such as this.
Very interesting. Let's now turn to Fernando. We didn't hear you for a while, but there's a lot on which you can definitely also give your
Okay,
views.
it's okay.
And we are now right in the middle of the final element or final part of our discussion, which is indeed the impact of this Ukraine crisis on the relationship between Europe and Africa. A question that was also put to us by Leticia in the comments. Fernando, how do you see that? Looking at what was said by Ottilia and Lidet, how do you see this relationship Europe-Africa, particularly now with the opportunities provided and with the long-standing demands of Africa also to have a change and reform of the UN system? Will Africa and Europe have the potential to become real allies in this rules-based international order?
Look, I do believe that weaker countries that can unite has a very great interest in multilateralism, so that institutions can function and can take decisions. So I believe that the process of regionalism in Africa is a very important thing for the whole of the African countries. Another part of the world that has encouraged in its formation, let's say, a multilateral approach to everything is the European Union, despite its problems. So that's something in which, let's say, Africans and Europeans agree. We want a multilateral world. We want to have a voice in this new world that is being created against multilateralism. This has not begun with the Ukrainian crisis and the Ukrainian war. It has begun some years ago with Mr. Trump, probably even earlier. But he was really a voice in the sense of, I am against multilateralism. I am in favor of the return of the balance of powers. And that's when we saw regional powers resurge again, like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, like India, like, well, China is a global power, etc. Others. They have a particular interest in coming back to this individual way of extending their power. So I think that we share this particular interest for various reasons. A second point is that coming back to the crisis and the war in Ukraine, I am convinced, my conviction may not happen, but I'm convinced that Ukrainian will enter the European Union this week. And being a member of European Union, we will have the country that produces more food in the world inside the European Union. I can tell you, and of course you know, of some European countries that import food from Ukraine. And if the war does not stop, and I am convinced it will stop but that's again a conviction. I hope I'm right. It's not stopping now. I hope I'm right. That means that something completely different, some Europe completely different will appear in the front of the African countries. If one speaks about, for example, the relationships between Russia and the African countries, one speaks about around $20 billion per year. But these $20 billion are composed by two things, oil and guns. The rest is almost nothing.
Weapons.
Weapons, oil, and debt.
Mm.
These are the three elements of the equation. If one speaks about China, one speaks about a window of opportunity that existed in the beginning of this century, and I should say that what was well, it was a good thing for a lot of Africans, the investment and the financing infrastructures that China has done in Africa. But that was a moment where China had the greatest superavits in the world. Now, China has no superavit. It has a deficit. It has no reserves at all. If she wants to finance anything, she has to go on debt itself. So that China that has money to do everything ended, finished. It will not come back again. Of course, it will continue to be big. It will continue to be important, but it is not already the same. Where are the greatest superavits in the world in this moment? Are in Germany. Germany has 7 to 8% of superavit in its budget. So the great plan of Xi Jinping, building those railways across Central Asia and Russia, just coming to Hamburg and then Europe, that had to be in a sense that the Germans have the money, we have the industry, we build the infrastructures, and let's do business. This was the point. The same thing that the states have done with Europe. The states have the money, the dollars, they continue to have, but they had more at the end of the Second World War. They flooded the world with money, investments, and financing, and they conquered it, economically speaking. So China thought the same way, but it lost the opportunity, in my opinion. It will continue to be a very big country. It will continue to be second, the third, or the first more important geopolitical, geoeconomic country. It has a lot of domestic and regional problems. There are not only one country that is neighbor of China, that is friend of China. There is not one, not even North Korea. North Korea is not a friend of China. Is a nightmare for China. Is a nightmare. The South China Sea is a nightmare for China. Okay, and now with this war in Ukraine, Central Asia and relations with Europe are a nightmare for China. Okay, and Russia and Africa, what has Russia to offer to Africa is guns and oil. And what is happening already is that inflation has entered in our pockets, in Europe, in Africa, everywhere. It will continue. This war is also a flooding inflation. So the conditions will be worse. Coming back to the beginning of my speech, I believe that in a long-term perspective, and I believe the practicalities are the more important thing on the day-to-day life. I agree with you. But in a long-term perspective, I see not solidarity. Countries do not have solidarity. Countries have interests. People are solidary. Countries, they have interests, even when countries have the interest to show solidarity. That's an interest to show solidarity. So the interest of the African countries and the interest of the countries of the European Union is to maintain, rebuild, and strengthen a multilateral world at United Nations and everywhere where they can. This is the moment for a political discussion among the two parts. And my last thing, is we have an example, a practical example in Africa. Who are the countries that are in favor of Russia invading Ukraine? Let's nominate them. Sudan, coup d'etat, dictatorship. Mali, coup d'etat, dictatorship. Central African Republic. And these are countries where mercenaries, private mercenaries linked to Putin in Russia are operating, militarily speaking. And these countries are, well, I don't like the way French act in security terms in Sahel. That's not my point. But my point is that we do not solve the problems by substituting French by Russians, okay? And those dictatorships and those elites in those countries will not solve the problem, because the problem is on the relationship between the people and the leaders inside those countries. So my point is, we are in a change, a very, very quick change, in which there is really a window of opportunity to a strengthening, because the interests are the same now. Unfortunately, because of what?
Yeah, thank you, Fernando. We still have less than 10 minutes, but I would like to have a reaction by our African friends. As we talk at this moment, I think there is a General Assembly meeting taking place on the Ukraine issue. So this will also be quite telling for the types of statements that you are making. To what extent do you believe indeed that this is...
Geert, please let me add one thing. A very, very great problem for Europe. That has not to do with this war, but this war will probably, this war is a tragedy, whatever result it has. It is already a tragedy. But it shows very quickly a strong weakness inside the European Union, which is we do not have an electrical grid in Europe. The electrical grid of Spain and Portugal are not linked to the central of Europe. Why? Because of France. Because the electricity in France is produced by nuclear plants. And France had never the interest to let links of energy pass through Spain, through the Pyrenees to France, because of this, because of national interests. And now, because of this war, probably the European countries will be able to discuss really this issue. And Africa may be, mostly north of Africa, may be an element of this thing, because one part of the gas that is coming to the southern Europe is coming from Algeria, Libya, and Nigeria through gasoduct. So these is concrete examples of, let's say, a very political issue that has to do with economics, that has to do with energy transition, that has to do with the gas in this thing, and that has an influence in something that will go on in Europe itself. Sorry, Geert.
No, but it's true what you say. In only 5 days, I think the weaknesses in our European energy, in our European defense policy, and so on, have been very clear. And I could very well imagine that appropriate action will be needed. But the same is probably the case in Africa. You probably also will have a lot of losers from this crisis, probably also a few winners. And what I read, for example, is that those countries that import cereals from both Ukraine and from Russia will be really having a hard time. The price of bread will go up in most of the Maghreb countries, and we've seen that this has given rise in the past to the Arab Spring and so on and so on. So how do you see, Lidet, this Ukraine crisis in terms of losers and winners in Africa, but also in terms of a strengthened partnership between Europe and Africa? 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Yeah. Ottilia can have the final word.
Yeah, indeed. I think the fact that this war will have an economic and, of course, a human impact for most, but a global economic impact will also affect Africa, because Africa is part of the global financial system. But as you rightly say, Ukraine is one of the top exporters of wheat and also guns, actually, to the African continent. So the fact that it's not able to export as much will have significant implications for food security in different parts of the continent, including in East Africa and the Horn of Africa, where we currently have drought, for example. Ethiopia is one of the biggest importers of Ukrainian wheat. And that shortage could technically exacerbate the shortages there. But the other aspect is also, politically speaking, especially if this war continues to be framed not as a war of international aggression, but one where there's underneath it is a confrontation between the West and Russia, and if there are like two camps in which everyone then must fit into, I think this further exposes countries that want to maintain some sort of relationship, differentiated relationship, on a case-by-case basis with both camps, because I think all countries maintain some sort of relationship, even with countries that are considered belligerent. Nobody just negates the partnership they have with Russia or the partnership they have with the US because one has turned out to be an aggressor in another state. So this puts a lot of countries in a shaky situation or in a politically sensitive situation. But I think what Fernando said around multilateralism and the fact that the two continents have significant stakes in maintaining multilateralism is valid. I absolutely agree with that point. But I think we also need to be aware and conscious and acknowledge, I think, that the discontent with multilateralism didn't come because of multipolarism, or because there is a war in Ukraine this week. But a lot of actors that are part of multilateralism, including African actors, have to a large extent felt like they are part of the system, but the system hasn't absorbed them or included them or represented them equitably and fairly. So this question around equity and fairness and representation of multilateralism, and the fact that it needs to work not for the post-war power holders, or not for the pre-war, post-war, and former colonials and those actors that are heading the various multilateral fora in the world that are, holding veto powers in the UN Security Council, but that it needs to look more like the membership. The UN needs to look more like its members, in that the UN Security Council also needs to adapt itself and adapt to how power is distributed these days. I think is a point that we should take with us, because if multilateral fora are not reformed, it is really questionable to what extent African countries could benefit from it, because there's only so much multilateralism could provide you if you're not part of the decision making process. And that part, I think, is a missing link that we don't discuss often, but one that perhaps needs to come to the fore going forward.
Okay.
Thank you, Lidet. Ottilia, you have the last word. Your views on this Ukraine crisis and the implications for Africa, and the implications, of course, also for the continent.
Right. I have maybe 30 seconds to do that. I think a lot has been said already.
No, it's okay.
2 minutes. Go on, no problem.
Yeah. Look, a lot has been said already in terms of the situation, and obviously it is unfolding at the moment. The UN General Assembly is having, its 11th emergency extraordinary session, which, by any measure, considering that until now, at least until 1981, these had focused primarily on the situation between Israel and the occupied territories of Palestine, in itself speaks volumes. It speaks to the urgency of the matter. It speaks to the great concern globally around addressing the issues, complex as they are, not only political, but also the impact that it has on the global economy. The price of oil is rising at the moment, and the countries that will be most affected by a sharp increase in the cost of oil are those for whom already the cost of living is high, and that is on the African continent. if anything from the discussion that we've had this evening by way of takeaway, and then I'll end there, it's something that both Fernando and Lidet have said. Multilateralism matters for Africa and for Europe. If Europe were in any way considering any departure in any way or form from multilateralism, this conversation, but also global events have said where you can have a cluster of the most possible representation in a global multilateral system, that will be your way to be able to effect change. So perhaps we will see UN reform, but importantly for our conversation, hopefully we can build a mutually respectful relationship between Africa and Europe that recognizes what each brings to the table, even in respect of situations that are not in Africa alone. And Ukraine, however unfortunate the circumstances are, has opened the door for Europe to also consider the views of Africa in respect of international conflicts that are not on the continent. Thank you. And sorry, I've taken a minute and a half extra.
Yeah,
I hate people over their time.
you made the perfect synthesis of this 1.5 hour talk. So thanks so much for that, because this was a very interesting discussion. I'm sure that there's, of course, much more to be said, and we will have to see how the situation will evolve in Eastern Europe in the next days and weeks. But there's definitely a lot of interesting opportunities for having, as you rightfully said, a more respectful partnership where there is really going to be attention paid to some of the African aspirations in the multilateral system as well. So this is an opportunity. Let's hope that it will be seized by the leaders in both continents. Thank you very much for this interesting discussions, and we'll stay definitely in touch for future events, because this is a story that is, of course, not yet ending. Fernando, I don't know whether you still have to say something as Club de Lisboa.
No. Just you can say, Gert, but we can all of us say and say thank you for those that are accompanying us from somewhere else. Good evening for everybody, including for you.
Thanks a lot, Lidet. Thanks a lot, Ottilia. Thanks a lot, Fernando. Thanks a lot, Jessica, behind the screens. And see you next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good
Bye.
night. Bye.
Thank you.